He's sucking eyes. So he's just a
Bert Prins asks, how to change incentive structures of the elites? That's a very complicated question. Produce/control a useful technology. Well, technology can definitely change incentive structures. That's my main argument. Certainly most of history is we have to look at the incentive structures. We have to look at how technology impacts incentive structures. So, for example, if you're living in an agricultural pre-industrial society, from an elite perspective, the best, most important, most significant technology you can have are human beings. The more human beings you have at your disposal, the more human beings can be sent to the mines to extract ores, who can be put on farms and make use of the land. Really, prior to mechanization, prior to the invention of machines, the most important resource that you can really have are human beings. And they can specialize in their roles. You can have people who are doctors, soothsayers, astrologers, priests. You can have people who are craftsmen, shoemakers, clothes makers, smiths, You can have people of various professions, disciplines, people who are warriors, people who are skilled in battle. So you can have a whole lot of people, but mostly the technology or the utility or the tool or the thing that you want is you want a lot of people and you want high quality people. But there's really no downside to having more human beings because people sort of take care of themselves, right? In that environment, people can't really survive unless they work. There's no parasitism that's really allowed in terms of, the individual being able to leech off of society. It's not really permitted at that time. And part of that has to do with technology, the state of medical technology, the fact that if someone is physically weak, you can try your best to save them, but medicine at that time simply, it wasn't this money sink that it is today, right? Today, we have a situation where someone can have a disease, and if you just throw enough money at the wall and you just keep, research and development and new drugs and new therapies and new techniques and all sorts of life support, cybernetic, cyborg, fusion of the man. I mean, that's what the ventilators are, right? It's something out of an H.R. Geiger artwork where you're shoving a ventilation tube down into their lungs and sucking out this fluid. I mean, there's something, it's like that scene from The Matrix where Neo wakes up for the first time and he's in the pod with the orange goo, the orange pink goo, and he wakes up and he pulls what is actually a ventilator out of his lungs. I mean, it's an incredible scene. It's disgusting, but it's incredible. That wasn't possible at the time. So if you're an elite living in that kind of scenario, and it does extend into the Industrial Revolution as well, we can talk about the way that the relationship changes. But essentially, if you're an elite, you just want people having as many kids as possible because it's almost a self-regulating system. The technology doesn't exist to save people's lives for the most part. I mean, there are leeches and there are herbs and there are traditional healing methods, but those don't really cost a lot of money. As you throw gold into a healing method, you don't really get a lot of efficacy out of that. The diminishing returns start pretty quickly. They're pretty intense. Whereas now we have, instead of diminishing returns, we have almost linear returns where the more money you put into healthcare, the more you get out of that. in terms of being able to save lives, extend lives, and so on. Quality of life is a different question than quantity of life, but we certainly have been able to extend the quantity of life. So yeah, technology is very important in terms of changing incentive structures, because if you have a system which is pretty much self-regulating, then the elite can say, all right, well, everyone should have as much children as humanly possible, and those who are not capable are just going to be sort of weeded out. They're not going to result in a Malthusian problem or Malthusian crisis, because it just is what it is. Just, peasants will have 8 kids and 6 of them will die, and therefore they'll remain pretty much at replacement or even below replacement. And then the aristocracy, or the people who are capable of rising up through a semi-meritocratic system with some social mobility, they'll be able to survive and have more kids and whatnot. But when you have a situation where technology comes and changes the incentive structures, all of a sudden the elites start promoting antinatalism. That isn't because the elites became evil or they changed in their fundamental nature necessarily, although like the semantics of that, I guess we could get into the specifics of, what exactly all of that means. But my opinion is essentially that the elites haven't changed necessarily. You can have the same exact person, and we saw this over the course of the 20th century. We've seen people who had certain opinions, and then they changed those opinions over time. When you look at the foundation of so much of what we consider to be the left today, or liberalism today, and we look at the people who really helped get that started, they didn't start off necessarily having left-wing or liberal positions in the way we would think of them today. And so to me, it's a question of changing incentives. Provide some kind of currency. Well, currency comes from authority, right? So if we use a currency, whether it's Bitcoin or US dollars or anything else, currency is just authority. I mean, all capital is social capital. It's funny that we consider social capital to be almost a subset or a metaphor for real capital, but quote unquote real capital is just a subset of social capital. So, if you have authority, you can invest that authority into a currency. Bitcoin, there's a lot of different theories about Bitcoin, but essentially Bitcoin at the very least is a product of the structure of the internet. You can't have Bitcoin with that. I mean, maybe theoretically, you don't need an internet connection to hold Bitcoins, but in order for Bitcoins to have value in an economy, you really do need an internet structure. So in a lot of ways, Bitcoin is piggybacking off the structure that we have, and therefore it's sort of reinforcing the structure in a way. So, I don't know if creating a currency is a way to change the incentive structure, but certainly there is a feedback loop between new currencies that are coming into vogue and existing power structures. So Bitcoin comes into vogue and sort of reinforces this internet economy and the internetization of our civilization. Next sentence here, have the ability to influence key parts of society through media. Again, obviously, if we look at these 3 questions here, the first one, a useful technology, that, oftentimes we think of in war, there's an invention of firearms or an invention of a strategy or technique. The Romans pioneered a lot of military technology, not just in terms of, the swords were better or the armor was better, but in terms of the tactics and the strategy and the discipline and the training, that itself you could think of as a technology. So certainly the Romans, through their development of war technology, were able to gain power. Currency, I think we're getting at a question of mercantile power. And the ability to influence parts of society through media, we're talking about priestly power, right? So obviously, if you can influence society through media, that's a form of power. The question is, how do you get to the position where you're influencing society through media? It seems to me that the media talking heads who are put up in front of millions of people are not selected because they're the smartest or because they are the most accurate or what have you, but they're selected because they benefit or they're in line with the interests of the people who own those media companies. So it seems to me, if you're just talking about quantities of people, the best way to influence people these days is to just have a lot of money, and then you can own a media company, and then you can hire whoever you want, and you can put them in front of millions of people. But of course, there are esoteric, there's an argument to be made that maybe there's mass media, but then maybe there's a sort of esoteric media or elite media, or there are certain forms of media where, people might pay attention to it, and it might not be popular, but it might still be impactful because it's reaching a small number of people, but people who are very high quality, people who are in powerful positions. I guess the problem with that is that I believe that the majority of people, the masses, the millions, are very impressionable. And I myself it was proven to myself that I am of the people in a way. Situationally, like, we can't deny that. We can talk about power, but we cannot confuse speculation about power with actually being in the position of power. Those are two very different things. And so myself not being in a position of power, just theorizing about power, when coronavirus came, people began to speculate about it. And in retrospect, I see that all of the takes that I had, all of the opinions that I had, were purely fueled by the information that I was receiving. I didn't have some kind of external or outside perspective from this top-down media exposure system. I was receiving the takes that people were deciding that I should see. So I'm not outside of this system. I'm not looking from the top down. Like, if we're to think about the system as a sphere with different levels of centrality or whatever, I'm not outside of the sphere and looking down on the sphere and sort of like an alien, but I'm within this sphere of power. And it's kind of funny, I'm inverting the concept of the center versus the periphery. I'm saying that, in a sense here, being at the center of society means you are hemmed in. Remember that picture, that photo, that medieval concept of the earth as being set on a flat plane with a globe that is the heavens, and a man sort of sticks his head out of that globe, and he can see the true heavens, all the Platonic spheres and all the crazy angels and things out there. Or Plato's cave or something like that. In the way that I'm currently using this term center is not in a neo-absolutist way, but the term center, I think, as a spatial metaphor, we can think of the most impressionable members of society are at the center. They're simply receiving from what's outside them. They cannot distinguish truth from falsehood. They simply have to accept what they receive. And so they're sort of trapped. I'm trying to think of another visual metaphor for someone who is, Plato's cave or whatever. But you're surrounded by this media field that gives you this feed through social media implicitly. You don't question it. You don't scrutinize it. You just accept it for what it is. And so as we move out of this center into the intermediate, into the periphery, and then finally there's a concept that we could move outside of this sphere, and then we would be in a different sphere of power, or we'd be in some kind of vacuum or void. But in a sense, this is a psychological phenomenon. It's not merely a spatial phenomenon. It's not like, if I just leave the United States and move to China, I'm going to be completely free from American influence. Well, that's not true, because we internalize these influences psychologically, and we maintain, I'm not speaking about a mental diagnosis of schizophrenia where you're hearing voices, but what I'm saying is that narrative myths create neural pathways in the brain that allow us to interpret new data in a biased way. And so linguistics, and the English language, and the dialect, and the slang, and the terms that we use impact the way that we think about ideas. So even if I move to China, then in that case, I'm still going to have my American worldview internalized and taken with me in my suitcase, in my brain, and I can't really truly ever escape that or remove that. I can sort of change things on the margins, and there's some liquidity of the brain, and there's some flexibility and plasticity, but I'm always going to carry these spheres of power within my brain. And so it's not merely about moving from one place to another. And, there's I would say there's a certain plasticity, but it's a limited plasticity of our ability to sort of get outside of our perspective and see things from the outside and move into different spheres. There's senses in which we truly can forget things, that maybe we truly can forget events or experiences that impact us, and they can be removed from our mind. But there are other senses in which, even if we're not conscious of our memories, they still stay with us, they still imprint something upon us. And I think that's more common than people realize. And so the idea of getting outside of, society is very difficult. I was trying to, answer this question of the ability to influence key parts of society through media. I guess it's the idea of, what I was trying to say is that when you're at the center of society, if you're at the center of this media complex, it's very easy to be impressed upon by the media. So if you're just an average, everyday, normal person, it's very easy to hear about coronavirus, and one day it's just the flu, and so you believe it's just the flu, and then the next day everybody's going to die, and so now you're willing to give up the Constitution and everything you held sacred and dear to you, and then the next day it's just a flu again, and it's very, very impressionable. It's very, very this model of a person who I'm not distinguishing myself from entirely. This is a, as much as it is a critique or analysis of society and the masses, it's a form of introspection that I think everyone's impacted. Everyone can be modeled, or psychology, mass psychology, politics, culture, sociology can be modeled in this way. But as you move more closer and closer to power, you don't get closer to the center of society in this inverted metaphor I'm using. You actually get farther to the outside, and so you can see things more clearly, and you're not so much surrounded by this miasma. You're not in the middle of this dense fog. You're actually outside of the fog, and you can see into the fog, and you can see everybody moving around. And so I think it's difficult from my perspective, the idea that you can put out media and it's not going to reach the millions, and it's somehow going to reach the elite, and they're going to change their opinion based on this media. That's a little more difficult because those elite they're not as impressionable because they're somewhat outside of the system. And so it's you can put something in front of the average person. Let's think about something, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was presented to the American people as a just war against communism. We're saving the Vietnamese people. Obviously, we can look back on that retrospectively and say, well, all of that was a total lie. And yet the majority of people, at least at first, bought it hook, line, and sinker. And there was a minority of leftists and hippies or whatever who opposed that war, and who I would argue, in fact, were that leftist anti-war movement was in part funded by the government and promoted by the government as a way to subvert the Soviet Union, as a way to, create a inorganic, artificial left wing that would be tied to the American government ultimately. come from an American perspective. So, I mean, maybe that's a little bit off the tracks and would be hard to prove in the context of this video. But I think what might be more successful is something that is priestly, not just in terms of media, because what I'm trying to distinguish between is the type of person where, you know, you present a fact to them. You say, like, Saddam Hussein was throwing the babies out of the incubators. You present it as a fact. You know, the North Vietnamese attacked our ship in the Gulf of Tonkin. You present it as a fact. The average person will simply accept it, and they will simply support the government or whatever entity. It could be a corporation, it could be Google, Amazon, Microsoft. They'll simply accept it, and they'll simply support the narrative and the call to action and the moral panic. People who are actually in power, people who are elite, you can't just present facts to them and they'll just accept it in a way that is counter to their interests, that is counter to their incentives, because they can see things, I think, a little more clearly. I think they have access to better and more accurate information than the people on the ground. So if you wanted to use a priestly strategy, it wouldn't be about the presentation of facts. It would be about morality. It would be about some kind of priestly, you know, identity or myth narrative or aesthetics or something like that. Let's look. Providing security seems to be taken already, so difficult to get into maybe. Yeah, I mean, there is a security class, there is a military, there is a police force. People can get into these positions. The problem with the military is it's very much all or nothing. You're either completely doing the will of the elites, or you break away and you have a coup d'etat. Problem with the coup d'etat is oftentimes the coup d'etat is a bit of a false coup d'etat. I mean, if we look at the Bolshevik Revolution, one of the most, you know, revolutionary, antithetical to the previous system, just total inversion of Russian society, and yet 20 years down the line, in 1939, what do you end up with the Bolshevik Revolution turning into? It turns into a neo-Russian empire, a new feudalism, a new monarchism under Stalin. So the idea that you can truly, really have a revolution through the military alone is something I question. If you look at Spain, Francisco Franco, he basically founded himself, his great enemy. He wasn't a huge anti-Semite, to be honest. That wasn't a huge part of his public persona and his ideology. He wasn't a huge anti-racist. I mean, he had Moroccan troops, and that wasn't what he was about. He claimed to be a big supporter of the Catholic Church, and that's its own thing. What exactly is the Catholic Church, and how did it change historically? Vatican I, Vatican II. But really, the biggest enemy that Franco defined, not just leftism, not just communism, but the biggest enemy Franco would talk about would be the Freemasons. And ultimately, so Franco has this coup and he takes over. Everything changes, right? The anarchists and the communists, the leftists, social democrats are wiped out. He takes over. But what does he do during World War II? Effectively, he collaborates with the British to protect the Straits of Gibraltar, which are like the key to the Mediterranean. So effectively, I mean, and if you read the Freemasons themselves, they state clearly we were on the side of the Allies. So, it gives you a question of, like, when these military leaders have their coups, military leaders aren't so much thinking about the spiritual nature of things or the underlying esoteric nature of things. By their nature, they're almost opposed to that way of thinking. They're thinking about pragmatic engineering problems. How do we fix this? How do we build this bridge? How do we fight and defeat the enemy? And so they're not really thinking past the superficial. And I guess there's a question, you could question Franco's genuineness. Was he really genuine? To me, he's almost a Gorbachev figure in Spanish history, because he presents as this nationalist. Now, of course, we know Spain is one of the most feminist, refugees welcome leftist countries in the world. So he is sort of this Gorbachev figure as he presents himself as a defender of the faith. Same way Gorbachev said, I'm defending communism. And yet both of them sort of, you see the before and after picture, and it's pretty clear pragmatically what they were. So people can try to get involved with the security services. I don't know if that's a way to actually create political change, because we don't have a warrior-led system. We have, a priest and mercantile-led system. So it seems like just joining the security forces, you're getting yourself into a situation where you're just going to be kind of serving the status quo. That's what we see most of the military and police doing. There's all these theories about, you get experience and then you have a militia. Militia movements have been going on for a very long time. I think the silver shirts in America, that would be the 1930s. So militia movements have been around for a really long time. Militias don't seem to be effective at all. They seem to be a hobby for people. They seem to be a form of live action role playing. They seem to be a form of simulation of importance, and we're part of a militia, and things are going to collapse anytime now. When they do, we're going to take over. We're just waiting for the opportunity. And there have been people who have been very successful, relatively speaking, in terms of bank robberies and harassing the government, the weathermen up underground, and bombing the CIA. And so there have been militia movements in the United States that have done a certain amount of damage and have gained a certain amount of notoriety and have had millions of dollars in cash. And we could even refer to gangs as militia movements. MS-13, in a sense, is a militia movement. The Bloods and Crips are militia movements. Are they actually a threat to the power structure? Or are they, just like criminals, essentially, And if the power structure did collapse, then certainly these more primitive forms, I would call them really primitive states, I think they would be impactful, but that's really a question of whether the power structure is going to collapse in that way. When I look at the current situation, I see us moving into a Caesarism. I see us moving into a second religiousness. And so if you look at the Roman Empire, it took the Roman Empire about 5 centuries to fully collapse. From the time of Julius Caesar up until the time of the invasion of the Vandals and the Goths and the Ostrogoths. And even then, the Justinian in the East was still calling himself a Roman. He was still invading Italy, and so it was a very long process. Of course, the Byzantines didn't fall until the 15th century. So, this is going to be a gradual process. I don't think it's going to be the overnight collapse that people are expecting. I don't think that actually happens historically. When you look at the Soviet Union, I don't believe the Soviet Union collapsed overnight. I think that's a total myth. I think it took decades for the Soviet Union to collapse. I think really the Soviet Union collapsed with the death of Joseph Stalin, which was under very mysterious circumstances. Let's see. Provide important service that will hurt the elites when it will take away, those kind of things. Yeah, again, that's an option. If you're providing an important service, let's say you're a welder, which of course there's like a $20 an hour style welder, but there are people who can get very specialized with it and make millions of dollars. If you are the guy who knows how to work on the specific ship in the specific way or the specific machine, and you're one of the only guys in the world who is specialized down to that degree, the same way if you're a surgeon and you specialize very well at radioactive colonoscopic cancer treatments, make millions of dollars. So specialization in a way can provide you with a lot of money. We look at the case of South Africa, which is in many ways a third world country, very dangerous country, a lot of problems there. But there are still a lot of rich people who live in South Africa because they have a lot of money, and so they can insulate themselves from all the problems. You look at California. California has a lot of gang violence. California has a lot of drug addiction. California has a lot of homelessness. California, in a lot of ways, some parts of it look like a third world country. But if you have a lot of money, if you have millions of dollars, you can live very well and you can insulate yourself from all those problems. Is that a way to actually change the structure of the elites? Well, I think that's more of a survival method. And I think if you survive long enough, opportunities will present themselves for you to insert your influence. If you build up a very anti-fragile structure and the surrounding superstructure is going along and it's oscillating, it has periods of strength, it has periods of weakness. You can identify those periods of weakness, take advantage of them, and insert yourself and marginally gain more power, not in an explicit, flashy way if we're going to have a street march, but you sort of insert yourself in a hidden way, esoteric way, through crypsis perhaps. That, I think, is a proven strategy. Could be interesting to talk about successful strategies, dive in a little deeper into what makes them work. Remains a bit abstract. I get the impression one should focus almost exclusively on gaining an important position, hoping you'll get to attach something you find important like that, or attach yourself to an existing structure, like you mentioned. Hope some of your interests can be integrated into it. Maybe a particular church can be made pro-white without making it outcast in society. Well, I think the whole pro-white thing, as I've discussed, I think this comment was made on my anti-racist video. So yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to me, this concept of populist minoritarianism. That is, when I say that, I mean people who present themselves as of the masses but clearly are not of the masses. I think the Bolsheviks are an example of this, communism in general. We're of the proletariat, we're of the masses, and all those people who advocated for that clearly were not of the masses. Maybe in an economic sense, maybe they came from a poor family or a lower class family in some cases, although not all cases. But clearly, if we're talking about meritocratic ability, they weren't mediocre people. These were quite high-level people, and their interests were not just about proletarianizing the society, making everything equal and whatnot, but it was really about putting themselves in charge. They didn't like the old elite. They wanted to be in charge, and they were successful through a populist strategy. The society that the communists invented was not an egalitarian society. Certain people on the top, certain people on the bottom. Changed who was in that elite. It was no longer the Russian aristocracy, who in many ways were a cosmopolitan European aristocracy. I mean, they had Germans, and they had English, and they had Dutch, and they had French, and they had all kinds of Italian influence. So there's an aristocracy that existed in Russia that was distinct from the masses of the people. Then you had these Bolsheviks who were also distinct from the masses of the people, but who appealed to the masses of the people, who had a message that was populist. But in the actual pragmatic, practical running of the Soviet Union, there was clearly a distinction between the people who were running the show and the vast majority of the people. And it wasn't a situation where, everyone lives the same way and everyone has the same rights and privileges. And maybe it was more meritocratic. Maybe it was a system where you had more social mobility. But to me, there's a difference between social mobility and equality, right? And I guess it's the difference between equity and equality, right? You could say in the Soviet Union, there was greater equality of opportunity, that anyone could go to university, anyone could get a degree, anyone could move up in the Communist Party. But that once you achieve that level of power in the Communist Party, then you start to monopolize power. Then you start to insulate yourself from challengers, as Stalin did and successive party people did after him. The KGB as an institution insulated itself from external pressures in the Soviet Union, gained a sort of semi-independence, and in many ways has survived the collapse of the Soviet Union with people like Putin. That's part of how Putin got in power, is he was this influential guy in the KGB. And so as a result, the KGB sort of put him in power as their guy. Now, I guess today it's called the FSB rather than the KGB, but basically the same institution. Let's see here. I guess we were talking about addressing I don't know how many times I have to address the concept of, in order for a collective to be successful, it can't simply be based on haplogroups and FBI statistics and obscure phrenological charts and this sort of things and studies. That's not what a successful collective is based off. A successful collective is based off mythology. Faust just did an interesting video on the Anglo-empirical liberal tradition and its form of racism versus like the German idealism. I thought that was a good video. So yeah, the concept of like, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that people who call themselves pro-white are a cult, they're a tribe, and in many senses they're a minoritarian group that doesn't recognize itself as such. In some senses, you could say they're similar to the Bolsheviks in the sense that they claim to speak for millions of people, but in fact are, millions of people are quite alienated from them, have nothing to do with them. It's kind of a weird and esoteric thing to most people. And you could ask yourself, how did the Bolsheviks come to power? What's the relationships there? How does something like that actually happen? And I would say it has to do with incentive structures. I would say it has to do with the fact that the Russian Empire was extremely stultified, had very low social mobility. You essentially had a huge potential in Russia where there were many ethnic minorities who had a lot to contribute, had a lot of brain power, but they were inhibited from contributing because they weren't of the Russian aristocracy. And so by smashing the Russian state, you basically allowed all of these ethnic minorities to express their potential. Whereas previously that was inhibited. And so, the Russian state as a result was very slow to change and slow to adapt. After the Russian Revolution, all of a sudden you start getting this rapid industrialization. There's genocide that comes along with that, which is unfortunate. But you essentially get the liquefaction of society. It is a very capitalist process where, everything is uprooted and everything is changed and everything is turned topsy-turvy. And there's a kind of Hegelian synthesis where things kind of return to a new normal at the end of that process. And then communism has its own sort of stultification and is unable to continue to change and adapt. But I think that's when a society becomes primed for revolution, is when it's no longer adaptive. And when I look at the current elite, I don't see a group of people who are unable to adapt to changing circumstances. I don't see a group of people who are, first of all, I don't see a group of people who are centered around a hereditary monarchy, which is a very, some people have argued it's a stable system, but it's also not a very meritocratic system, right? It's just you just have the father and the son and the father and the son and all the way down the line. And regression to the mean says you're eventually going to get some pretty mediocre kings or czars. And there's nothing you can do about that. You just have to sort of accept that leadership. And whatever, if they listen to the right people and they have the good advisors, then things might work out. And if they don't, then they don't. The marketization of the West is a very powerful thing. The level of competition that we have in the West, the ability for big key players to just suddenly go to jail, there is a certain instability in the Western aristocracy that you don't see in Russia. In Russia, if you're an aristocrat, you're an aristocrat. No one can take away your aristocratic rights. No one can take away your aristocratic privileges. That's not how it is in the West. A lot of times people on the right will criticize the elite and say, oh, well, they're so stuffy and they don't know what's going on and they're ignorant and they're, just trapped in their own Hollywood mansions. They don't understand what it's like on the street for the average person. But I think the Western elite is much more fluid and much more subject to pressures and much more... if you're a Western elite, literally nothing is guaranteed to you. I was just watching a little 10-minute little mini documentary about Notch, the inventor of Minecraft. And Notch sold Minecraft for, I think, over $2 billion. So Notch, as far as I know, is a billionaire. And so my question is, when Notch makes these edgy tweets, which you can look up all the history of what he said and done, it's like he's a billionaire. All these right-wing people have been saying, oh, well, we just need one billionaire to support us. And then all of a sudden, because, we're so good, we have this low budget and we perform so well and so little money. And look at our opposition. They have so much money and they're so mediocre. If we just had one billionaire, all our problems would be solved. Well, you've got Notch. Why can't Notch do anything? Is it because he doesn't want to do anything? Is it because he's afraid of being politically incorrect? I mean, what exactly is it with Notch? Does he just not care? Is he just apathetic? So I think Notch is a good example of the failure of that kind of thinking, where the Western elite really is under a great deal of pressure to perform and to protect themselves, because they sort of know at any moment they can be taken out. They can be thrown in jail. It's not like the Russian aristocracy, where you're basically, it's a feudal system where you're a tyrant and you can kind of do whatever you want. That's where the myth of the vampire, the aristocratic vampire, comes from, is the idea that you have this aristocracy and it can just prima noctis, extract the maidens from the population and prey like a predator. Like the aristocrats like a wolf, and the population, they're all sheep. And the idea that, I'm not saying that happened. I'm not saying the Russian aristocracy was extremely sadistic. But what I'm saying is that it was a very, quote unquote, stable system. But the problem with that stability was it was kind of fragile. It was fragile. It didn't have the anti-fragility of the West, where I think in the West, you're constantly seeing people, rise to prominence and then become irrelevant, rise to prominence and become irrelevant. So I think the Western elite there are much more pressures, and there's more sort of cycling in and out of new blood in and old blood out, and continuing to do that, which I guess the weakness, if you compare that to something like China, the West has a problem theoretically with creating long-term plans, which China doesn't. But I'm not even sure if that's true. Maybe that's true on an exoteric level. But if there was an interview with Putin where he said, I've lived through 3 presidents now, President Bush and President Obama and President Trump. And every single one of these presidents comes in and he says something different. Bush says he's going to go to war on terror, and Obama says he's going to close Guantanamo. And then Trump says something different. But what I find is that there's these men with black suits who come in and they set everything straight, and essentially the policy remains the same. I think empirically that's really what we do see. So the idea actually that the West is incapable of long-term planning, on the surface, there don't seem to be any, if the president has a 4 to 8 year term, then obviously if the president is the true sovereign, then it's impossible to do long-term planning. But if the FBI, the CIA, and even deeper levels of organization exist, then effectively you can do long-term planning. So I would even question some of the China shilling and a lot of the underestimation of the West. How does this relate to the question at hand? Yeah. Maybe we can bring up, I have been trying to use Discord less as a, less as a chatting platform, where anybody can just come along and say anything that they want, and it's just all, free form and memes and fun and happiness. Of course, that I'm a big curmudgeon when it comes to those things. But we're going to take a look at maybe I did do some categorization of really just different ideas, and I wanted to take a look maybe at, and we'll see if we can make this slightly smaller. Let's edit the transformation here. 500. Let's see how that looks. Okay. It's looking pretty good here. So we are looking a little bit at Armenians as a minoritarian group. Just to give people a specific example, there are 3 million Armenians in Armenia. Yep. And outside of Armenia, there are 5 million in the diaspora. Most of them live either in Russia or the United States, but there are also significant populations in France and Germany and Georgia and surrounding countries, Lebanon, Syria, Ukraine, Brazil, and Greece. So they are definitely, if you think about the Jewish people, official statistics say there are 6 million Jews in Israel, 6 million Jews approximately in America, and then a few million outside of that. And people usually describe Jews as a diaspora people, with Armenians are even more of a diaspora people by that standard. So this is just, some screenshots from Wikipedia here. Hidden Armenians or crypto-Armenians is an umbrella term to describe Turkish people of full or partial ethnic Armenian origin who generally conceal their Armenian identity from wider Turkish society. They're mostly descendants from Ottoman Armenians who were outwardly Islamized and Turkified or Kurdified under the threat of physical extermination during the Armenian genocide. A Turkish historian, Erhan Bazyurt, describes, or maybe that's Bashirt, describes hidden Armenians as families, and in some cases entire villages or neighborhoods, who converted to Islam to escape the deportations and death marches, but continued their hidden lives as Armenians, marrying among themselves, in some cases clandestinely reverting to Christianity. And that is interesting, the concept of crypsis as an effective minoritarian strategy, rather than flaunting your rebelliousness and, oh, we're so different from you Turks and we hate you and we're different and we're going to have a march, we're going to have a parade, we're going to have a pride parade, we're going to have, we're going to advertise, hey, we all live here, you should come and get us, you should come and fight us, you should come and take us out. Rather than doing that, you practice crypsis. So that's an example of how Armenians have survived under huge ethnic pressure and religious pressure. A little map of geographic distribution. So we've got here, of course, Armenia being in the center, and then this part, which is part of Azerbaijan. Weird thing going on here between Armenia and Azerbaijan is that Armenia actually splits Azerbaijan in two. And so there's like part of Azerbaijan on the left side of Armenia, and then most of it's on the right side. But Armenia really ethnically extends into Azerbaijan significantly. It also goes up into Georgia. So the Armenian population obviously is, bigger than the Armenian state, and extends into these surrounding regions. And then they're in Turkey here, over 50% in certain regions, also a lot of crossover with the Kurds. So you see some of these parts of Turkey are minority Turkish because there's over 50% Armenian, as well as you've got Kurds. And so Turkey as a whole is, you could say in some ways, a Turkish minoritarian state. That is, the majority of people living in Turkey probably are not like ethnically Turkish in any meaningful sense, or are practicing some form of crypsis. So it is an interesting situation there in Turkey. We'll take a look here at the Ethno Religion. So Armenia established a church that still exists independently of both the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, having become so in 451 as a result of the Council of Chalcedon. Today, this church is known as the Armenian Apostolic Church, which is a part of the Oriental Orthodox Communion, not to be confused with the Eastern Orthodox Communion. During its later political eclipses, Armenia depended on the church to preserve and protect its unique identity. The original location of the Armenian Catholicosate, that's a new word to me, is Ekmiadzin. However, the continuous upheavals which characterize the political scenes of Armenia made the political power move to safer places. The church center moved as well to different locations together with the political authority. Therefore, it eventually moved to Cilicia as the Holy See of Cilicia. So very important when people talk about, we're nationalists and we believe in preserving our people And we need to be secular, or we can't get into religious infighting, because that's going to destroy our solidarity. If as a strategy toward gaining like political power, democratic power, that could be a short-term strategy that's employed, but in the long term, it really does seem like having an ethno religion is a very powerful means at preserving a group and promoting the interests of that group. Just a little side note here on Armenia and anti-Semitism. In 2015, a statement by Rima Varjapetyan Feller. He is the president of the Jewish community, which is like an interesting phrase. Stated in 2015, Jewish community feels protected. Authorities respect their rights. There's no anti-Semitism in Armenia. We enjoy good relations with Armenians. Community has certain problems that originate from the general situation. But there's this guy, leader of the Armenian Aryan Union, who is trying to expel people. And he was arrested in 2005. So there's some interesting stuff to look into with Armenia there, as an example of a successful minoritarian group. Of course, the Kardashians, famously. And I gotta start, you know what I'll start doing is I gotta create a little something here where I can just zip-zop into the big view. But the Kardashians are Armenians. I believe their family got famous through the O.J. Simpson case, where one of the Kardashians was a lawyer for O.J. Simpson. So they are sort of an interesting people, and their socioeconomic status in America, some of the things they're able to do. I know there's like a drum company or musical company, I forget the name of it, but is owned by Armenians. At certain points, I think they've become involved with jewelry trade in America. And they've maintained their identity in a lot of ways. So they're an interesting group, and an interesting example. Of course, they haven't taken over America. They're not like, I'm not suggesting some kind of Armenian conspiracy that Armenians control the world or they control the country. But what I'm saying is that Armenians came under significant pressure to either assimilate or die, and they resisted that pressure by creating a diaspora, by moving around the world, by gaining certain skills, by using an ethno religion, by using crypsis. So they used a lot of tools in order to survive, so that today they can be said to be a thriving diaspora. They're in a position to survive. Now, maybe if Turkey becomes weak at some point in the future, for whatever reason, they can seize upon that weakness. That's something that we're not just talking about decades, we're talking about centuries here, right? So this is a specific particular examples. Of course, there are innumerable examples that we could talk about. I mean, there are basically as many ethnic groups as exist in the world. That's kind of an exaggeration, but I would say, there are 200 countries in the world. I would say there are at least historically 200 minoritarian groups, if not many, many multiples more, that we could look at and analyze and see these patterns of, okay, they have an ethno religion, they have a diaspora, they practice crypsis, they gain certain positions, they corner certain niche industries, and you sort of see these patterns repeating themselves over and over again. So I sort of, as a amateur sociologist, looking at this and just saying this is objectively what all these groups do time and time again. If you want to survive in a hostile environment, this is sort of what you have to do. They don't do it as a quote-unquote race. They don't use Anglo-empiricism. They don't look at haplogroups. They don't look at phrenology. They don't look at FBI statistics, but they have ethno-religion, crypsis, diaspora, cornering niche industries, etc., etc. So that, I hope, was helpful toward answering Bert's questions. And Bert, if you do want to come on the channel, feel free to reach out to me. You know how to get in touch. But until then, we'll play the outro, and what'll we call this one? Something. I'll think of a title. Until then, bye-bye.